My name is Raul Lei, and I am a British Asian. I'm half Indian, a quarter Spanish, and a quarter Chinese, and I run an organization called Platform for Indian Democracy. My grandfather was born in India, in Nadiad, in Gujarat, and my grandmother was born in Kenya. And when they married, my grandfather moved to Nairobi to be with my grandmother, where he worked in the civil service. And through his work in the Kenyan civil service, he came and settled in the UK in the late 60s. On the other side of my family, both my Spanish grandmother and my Chinese grandfather came to work in the NHS in the 60s. So my grandfather came over from Singapore through India, and took him 3 months. My grandmother came from Spain as part of a program to support the NHS.
And your parents met in this country?
And my parents met in this country, working together in the late 80s. Yeah, so I still have family in India, but in the UK, my biggest source of family is my Indian family. So growing up, that community, that culture was very much central to my upbringing and to my development as a young adult and as a young British Indian. And when my grandfather left India, it was a very different time. But the stories of independence and the Quit India movement, stories of Gandhi, Sardar Patel, and Ambedkar, is kind of the India that I grew up listening about, and the amazing food, culture, this kind of tapestry of India, of the diversity that makes it amazing. And then they took that to East Africa, and our family was in Kenya. We had some family in Tanzania, Uganda as well, and seeing that culture and that links to India evolve through their life in East Africa, and again when they came to the UK. So my grandmother, like I said, was born in Kenya. My grandfather left India probably in the early 50s or mid 50s. I'm not exactly sure. My grandmother didn't tell me. So my grandfather died before I was born, and my grandmother didn't tell me many stories about India. But what she did tell me about India or through India was through her cooking and her food, and especially good Gujarati food. And that's where my connections to India really came from, was these messages of love, support, hope through food and the different dishes that she would cook. She's a woman of few words, but she said a lot through her food.
And did you have a chance to travel to India as well?
No, that's something I will be doing this year. It's something I've always wanted to do, and I think it will be an important moment for me.
And what is your relationship to East Africa? Can you say this again?
Yeah, so I went to Kenya for the first time last year for my cousin's wedding, and we still have some family who live in Nairobi. And it was, when my grandmother reminisces about Kenya, she talks of it as if it was a paradise, and like her memories of Kenya were just so beautiful, and how much she loved it, and the really vibrant Indian community in Kenya. And when I went, it just completely lived up to the stories that she would tell me, and how kind the people were, and the thriving Indian communities there. It's my uncle, my mum's brother, only really spoke Swahili, even in the home. So coming to the UK, that was a bit of a shock for him as well. So our family ties to East Africa really still run deep, and still somewhere that we visit as a family. I Just this sense of community, because we drove across Kenya. We spent a good amount of time there, and we drove from village to different towns, and just the sense of community and supporting one another, and just this kind of life where you support the community, everybody is there together. The warmness as well to tourists, and that kind of hospitality as well. It's not something I've experienced before. It was really quite powerful.
And what do you think is a relationship between the different communities? Of course, the majority population are Black African, and the Indian is quite a small minority nowadays. Did you come across this, or is it not?
It's not something I really noticed, but when we would meet local Kenyans, and they'd ask us where we're from, and we say the UK, and I would say I was a British Indian, and that my mother was born in Kenya. They were like, "Oh, so your mum's a Kenyan national, or you're one of us," and like that kind of boundaries between communities is not something I experienced at all in Kenya. It was actually quite the opposite. That, you know, learning that we were East African Indians and that my mum was born there, suddenly it was like we were even more like one of them. And yeah, so I didn't experience those boundaries in a way that I wasn't quite prepared for. It was really inclusive and welcoming.
But of course, you know about the colonial background. You know that Indians were in East Africa is related to the colonial empire.
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
I think it's different. You know, my family is from the three parts of my family. Two of them are from former colonies, and you know, when you look at the UK now as well, in terms of the demographics of the UK, it's that we're here because you were there, and yeah, in terms of the Kenyan context, it's not something I know too much about, but it's interesting seeing the movement, and still to this day, the movement of people is directly related to British colonialism. When you think of why the two main reasons why asylum seekers say that they come to the UK is because the English language is the most widely spoken across the world, and because they'd feel safe because they have communities already established here. Both of those are a direct consequence of British colonialism. But also the food that we eat, the culture that we're exposed to, the people from different backgrounds that we meet is a huge reason. It's because of British colonialism. My grandparents would have never met. My Chinese grandfather in Singapore would never have met my Spanish grandmother. You know, my family would never have left India to Kenya to the UK. So I'm very much a product of the British Empire. You know, for all of the atrocities that happened, this kind of blend of people and culture, I think is something that we can take pride in. My school chose as one of the modules for History A-level to teach about the British Empire. And so if I hadn't chosen history and my school hadn't proactively chosen to teach the British Empire, I would have known nothing about it. You know, the only things I heard about the British Empire growing up before I did my History A-level were good things. You know, rule Britannia, strongest navy in the world. We gave India the railways, which is something that really frustrates me. Or, you know, saying that we spread civilization. And then when you have political leaders like Boris Johnson in the early 2000s still saying that Africa needed to be colonized, and that, you know, and you see neocolonialism in the world, it's just so apparent how much of a lack of education there is around colonialism. And my teaching of learning about colonialism in school was really powerful for me, because when I was at school growing up, I received a lot of racist abuse from peers, friends, people who weren't my friends, and even teachers. And it was specifically targeting my Indian identity, and, you know, saying that I smelled of curry, that I was from the third world. I even had somebody who would brag and be like, oh, we slaughtered you in your thousands, that's why I'm better than you. And that was actually somebody who was a good friend, and they thought it was funny and a joke. So until I was about between the ages of 14 and 17, I would actually pretend that I was an Indian. So when people ask that inevitable question, where are you from? I would say, oh, I'm half Spanish, half Chinese. And, you know, as I was saying earlier, that my Indian family and the Indian community played a central role in raising me. So then to spend three years denying that part of my personality, or that part of me, my heritage, you know, took a huge toll, and, you know, would lead to an identity crisis. Who am I, or what am I? And then learning about we focused on the decolonial movement in my A-levels. And I started for the first time, like, I knew who Gandhi was and stuff, but I started really understanding about the levels of colonial atrocities in India, what India was before the empire, and the strength and resolve of the Indian community fighting an imperial power through non-violence. The ideas of the political philosophies that came out of the Quit India movement or the independence movement, the formation of the constitution, and I got this really fierce sense of pride that was just thinking, actually, why am I telling people that I'm not Indian? That should be the first thing I tell people. And so through that colonial teaching that I got at school, I actually found my identity as a British Indian, and really it shaped the rest of the trajectory of my life and my career, getting me into politics. Because, you know, by learning about India's history, just really inspired me to, you know, take that forward and draw on that legacy that as Indians, as East African Indians and as British Indians we have.
Getting into politics, you said did you study politics later on?
No, so I did philosophy for my undergraduate. I was really interested in the big questions and thinking deeply, but it was learning about colonialism that really got me thinking about politics. So actually I spent a lot of my time reading Indian political philosophy written by Gandhi, by Nehru, and other leaders of the independence movement. And then when I was at university, I started dabbling in political philosophy, and that's where I started to think about, you know, what society is, for example, moving from the state of nature to a social contract, to who society works for, what is good governance, and things like that. Because I wanted to go into law, and then I worked at Citizens Advice after I finished my philosophy degree and realised that I didn't want to defend people from the law. I wanted to change it so that, you know, the clients that I had would never future generations would never face the problems that my clients did. And that's when I went back to university and studied human rights and politics as a master's. But still, that, you know, when I was getting politically disillusioned at various points, I would always go back to the Indian political philosophy that first reminded me why politics is important, or why it was something that I wanted to get into. So yeah, it was a journey. So after my master's, I went into Westminster, and I was a staffer for a London MP, and that was fantastic. I thought my MP that I worked for she was very inspirational. She was a great leader, and it was a fantastic opportunity. But for me, it was a great time in Westminster. It was an interesting time, an interesting place, and, you know, a lot of the people there are doing some really inspiring work and are there to make a difference and make a positive impact. And I thought if I wanted to get into politics, I should be learning from these people. I should be in that environment. And then for me, again, my focus shifted towards India, and that's where I ended up at Platform for Indian Democracy. So Platform for Indian Democracy is a community-led independent organisation that is trying to bring together the British Indian community for those founding values of an independent India, for secularism, for democracy, equality, in India. And for the last decade or so, we've seen growing civil unrest, persecution, backsliding of democracy, and as British Indians, who remain very much connected to our homeland, it's about how can we use our voices to to advocate for those values that we carried with us from India to East Africa, some of us, and to the UK, and that we also fought for when we got to the UK, looking at like the Southall Black Sisters, Southall Monitoring Group, Asian youth movements, you know, fighting for those same values. And it's just saying that as a community, we remain committed to those values.
And this is a kind of grassroots
organization?
Or?
So we mainly work in communities, building communities, and so we do cultural activities, like we've done cricket matches, cultural balls, and exhibitions, and it's about raising awareness of what is happening, and also reconnecting, especially younger British Indians, with India, and saying why do we need to be aware and involved with what's happening back home.
Right, you said back home, but you live in the UK, isn't it? Is it important to do something in the UK?
Yeah, I think for the platform specifically, or for British Asians?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, you know, politicians, policymakers talk about the living bridge between British Indians and Indians in India. you know, the Indian diaspora is the largest in the world. There's almost 2 million British Indians here in the UK. There is a real powerful connection, people to people. And it's a historical connection as well, with Britain being a formal colonial power in India. And I think, like I said, there wouldn't be so many British Indians here in the UK if it wasn't a former British colony. There won't be those deep, you wouldn't see Indian jewels in the monarch's crown. So there is that deep historical relationship, but also that people to people. People still go back and visit India, still have family there, still have property. They still worship in the ways that their families did in India. They still practice cultural dances or festivals, and that remains. And so it's such a large part. You know, the chicken tikka masala is now the English national dish. So there's such a deep connection between the two countries, and I think it's really important that we build the solidarity across people living in the UK and in India.
But you know, you say for democracy in India is a big topic. You know, is there not democracy right now?
I think there is democracy in India, but it's hurting. And it's not the responsibility of any one person or any one political party. When you live in a democracy, everybody has the responsibility to uphold certain tenets of democracy for free speech, freedom of religion, and that is wavering in India. And for us as British Indians, we want to use our voices to be a source of support and accountability to say that those important values that India fought so hard for to get off the British, and that we fought so hard for in the 60s and 70s and 80s, are valued and upheld. Democracy is always been in India, a part of India. You know, it's not something that has been given to India. Our ancestors fought, sacrificed so much to create the world's largest democracy. Nobody thought that we could do it. You know, Churchill said that any Indian leaders would be straw men. The idea that Indians could govern themselves was laughable. But through non-violence and a huge national struggle, Indians were able to create the world's largest democracy that is still there. When you look at pre-colonial, in the way the villages were set up, and there's always been this democratic kind of pulse in India, and it's just honouring that and upholding that commitment. The Constitution was a radical document that promised fraternity, equality, justice, and how it was birthed was just so inspirational, and it's just remaining true to that.
What is your identity today? How you feel?
I feel British. I think that is something I've always struggled with. You know, when I go, sometimes if I go to the Indian community, they go, "Oh, you're not really Indian. You know, you're a mix." Or I go to my Chinese family and be like, "Oh, you're English." You know, when you're mixed heritage, you never quite fit in anywhere, and it's something I really struggled with. And there's at times where I felt more closely connected to my Chinese heritage, or times where I felt more connected to my Spanish heritage or my Indian heritage. And I always saw that as a weakness. I didn't belong anywhere. I was floating between different community groups and didn't have a base. And then somebody once asked me, "Raul, do you feel British?" And I was really angry at that. And I said, "Well, no, not if people like you ask me if I am." And I took big offence to that. But as I've grown up, and I've been bouncing around my different communities and different heritages, I was like, I am British, but I'm not the British that they were thinking of when they asked that question. I am not, you know, that kind of rural Britannia white British. I am the multicultural, diverse, inclusive Britain that we've become, and part of that is drawing on all of my family backgrounds and my heritages to create me. You know, everybody is unique, everybody is individual. So I take strength from each of my family backgrounds, each of my cultural heritages to create myself. And I think that is innately British. You know, when you have your national dishes, tikka masala, and you have the diverse communities in major cities across the UK, and that, like I said earlier, I am a product of British colonialism, and that's the British that I feel, that kind of coming together of different cultures, different peoples, and drawing strength from that rather than having that be something I run away from.
How other people see you? Did you come across that anybody says, "Oh, you're foreign," or do you really belong to this place, or where do you really come from?
Yeah, I get that question all the time. I mean, I don't look, you know, some people don't think I look Indian, or I don't look Spanish, or I don't look Chinese. A lot of people think I look Middle Eastern. So once I was in Camden with somebody, and they'd gone to another stall, and I'd walked into the shop, and this guy goes, "You're Middle Eastern, aren't you?" And I was like, "No." And he goes, "Yeah, you are. Why are you lying?" I said, "I'm not Middle Eastern." And he actually stood in the doorway of the shop, and he goes, "You're not leaving until you tell me you're from the Middle East." And I was like, "Well, I'm not. I'm Spanish, Chinese, and Indian." But he just wouldn't have it. And I said, "Okay, yeah, I'm from the Middle East." He goes, "See, that's all you had to do." Or when, you know, with rising Islamophobia when I was in Birmingham, I would have people come up and shout terrorist at me, or you know, say, call me an Arab, or like in a derogatory way. And so I get that a lot as well. And a lot of other mixed race people that I know and speak to have a similar thing where they get misidentified with different places. But yeah, I mean, you always get the question, "Where are you from?" It comes with being an ethnic minority in this country, and it's an exhausting question to ask. So I would just say, "Oh, I'm from Woking." They're like, "No, where are you really from?" I said, "No, look, you're absolutely right. I was born in North London." And it's just like, I don't mind being asked that question, but if that's the first thing you ask me, if you look at me and you see, aha, they're not British, I'm going to go ask them where they're from. If you've come up and introduced me, we started talking, having a conversation, and you ask about my family heritage, then that's completely different. But having that kind of, the colour of your skin is the first thing and the most important thing I need to know. That's when I think it's a problematic question.
Was it anyway important in your upbringing, different languages?
No, and maybe unfairly I blame my parents, but I only spoke English at home. Most, if not all of my Indian cousins only speak English. They don't speak Gujarati or Hindi. When I'd go to Spain to see my family there, they wanted to practice their English, so I could be lazy. And now my Chinese family live in Singapore. English is a national language. So I've had the opportunity to be lazy in terms of languages, and now I try to learn now that I'm older. But it's something I deeply regret not learning, especially my mother tongues, all three of them, when I was younger. I think it's such a beautiful way to remain connected to that culture, and also when you visit these places and you can speak the language, and I think it's a really lovely and important connection. That's why I think, you know, language classes, or, you know, the way they're trying to bring back the Welsh languages in schools in Wales, or yeah, I think it's so important to remain connected to that. And I would like to say it's something I would do, that I am going to do, but I struggle with Duolingo, and my brain for languages is no longer there. So we'll see. But yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, looking at further in the future, what would be your wishes for? It could be for yourself, but it could also be for the society.
My biggest concern about the country and society at the moment is the rise of far-right politics. And I think the riots in August really put that into perspective. That where you have in Merseyside, they had checkpoints set up where any brown drivers were stopped and not let through. I would speak. My partner had a friend who was driving in Merseyside and reached one of these checkpoints, and she just picked up her young daughter from school, and her young daughter wears a hijab, and her mother doesn't. So they were seeing this checkpoint come up, and she was like, "You need to hide in the boot." So her young daughter is hiding in the boot whilst, you know, these groups that have created these blockades and they are asking, where are you from? Where are you going? You know, not where are you from in Merseyside, where are you from? Well, and she was terrified of what they'd do if they found her daughter wearing a hijab. I mean, that was in the UK in 2024. It's terrifying. And I think, as we've been saying, this kind of strength in multiculturalism, different cultures, different people, different religions, different backgrounds is so important. And it is modern Britain, you know, that kind of, we are here because you were there. And that's the legacy of colonialism. And it's the only, it's the only silver lining to colonialism, is the kind of connectedness of different cultures here in the UK, if you're really going to try and look for one. And to see xenophobia, racism, anti-immigration rhetoric being whipped up to distract from economic failures as a way to divide communities, I think is really dangerous, and our politicians should be taking the heat out of these debates and speaking honestly about facts, about how immigration actually keeps our society running, about the strength of having different cultures within our cities, within our towns, and putting forward that positive case, not fear-mongering, not, you know, accepting and adopting the language of the far right. And I think so much in the last few decades, whether that be austerity, the hostile environment, has been done to divide our communities, when really we should be building solidarity. And I think that is the most important thing that we can do at a grassroots level, is come together. I mean, in the wake of the riots, you've seen some beautiful spirits of community. You have imams opening the door to the rioters, saying, come in, ask us any questions, and then becoming really good friends with them after. Or you now see more multi-faith meetings with community leaders. You know, mosques handing out free food to members of the public. And, you know, there's been so much shows of solidarity and love, like in Walthamstow, the thousands of people that gathered. And that's what we need, bringing if our politicians are going to be divisive and not make that positive case, not bring communities together, and that's what we need to do at a grassroots level. We need to come together, show that, somebody said that we need to remind people of our common humanity, that we're all one, we're all the same. We may come in different packages, speak different language, practice different faiths, but we are all, you know, together, and remind of that unity. And in a world that's becoming increasingly divided and increasingly violent, I think that's the most important thing that we can do.
Do you have the feeling, does this far-right political agenda move a bit in the center of the society?
And it's really scary how this kind of legitimization of far-right politics and how it's entering into the mainstream is kind of giving a legitimacy to some awful, like some of the things coming out of the racism, or the debates of Rishi Sunak is English. I mean, I guess we've spoken about it here today, but there's actual podcasters who are debating whether Rishi Sunak is English. Or like there was videos. So a word that I heard a lot when I was younger that would really cut deep was Paki. That was what we were referred to as. And nobody has called me a Paki in a very long time. And during the riots, I was seeing videos of rioters in the UK, and there was this mother and a young girl, and they're both just screaming Paki at crowds. And I was like, I can't. And they were doing it so proudly in front of the police. And I would never, I just was shocked that is happening in 2024 on just so casually in public with no consequences. And yeah, it's definitely, you know, the fact that people were burning down, trying to burn down hotels with asylum seekers. You know, if you burn down a building full of men, women and children, you know that there's a possibility of them dying. So when they say, oh, they were just frustrated and were just destroying things, no, they went to a hotel full of vulnerable people and tried to burn it down. And I do think, you know, I was asked this question a lot of, do you hate the rioters? And I said, no, I don't. I don't think all of them are racist. You know, look at the areas they come from, the levels of deprivation. I don't think they're all racist, but I think they've been told that you can't get a GP's appointment, you can't get social housing, there's mold on your ceiling, rents are skyrocketing because these brown people essentially are coming into your country. Not that public services have been gutted from inside out with austerity, not that political priorities have shifted, not that the NHS is chronically underfunded, not that landlords are given more protection than renters. It's these unnamed, unfaced people who are coming in and stealing your jobs and your places on the NHS waiting list. And they have real economic grievances, but so have working class communities that are from ethnic minorities. So I think more needs to be done, like I was saying, on a grassroots level of bringing people together. Because if we're not going to be told the truth from our leaders, then we need to try and bring people together and build that solidarity and say we are not, migrants and ethnic minority communities in the UK are not the cause of these social ills. And to be honest, we're facing them as well. And it's about how we build that solidarity and come together in the way that communities have done in response to the riots. So it breeds hope. But the only way you can defeat hate is with love.
Who's responsible for this rhetoric? Is it new?
No, and I think like what I was saying earlier, that in a democracy, in society, everybody has a collective duty to uphold democratic principles. So it's not just politicians. It is journalists, the media, it is the judiciary, it is community leaders, it is individuals that have this duty to protect one another, be part of that community, and respect human rights, even on a daily basis. I think it's a collective duty and responsibility. And of course there are instigators, there are people that make the problem worse, there are people in positions that could fix the problems and don't. But if in our communities, even within the Asian communities, we're not treating each other right, or you saw the scenes in Leicester in the riots in 2022, if we're not treating others in our community with respect and being inclusive and diverse, then that's where we need to start.
But still, there's a rhetoric blaming minorities for the problems in the society. I'd like to hear your position to that.
Definitely, it's scapegoating.
It's not just a fringe.
No, I mean, it was a real source of pride to see Rishi Sunak become the first British Indian and first ethnic minority Prime Minister of the UK. No matter what, especially with the colonial relationship between Britain and India, to see an Indian Prime Minister outside Downing Street was really emotional. And even though politically I disagree with him, it was a really emotional thing to see him outside of Downing Street. And then a couple of weeks later, you hear him at the dispatch box about why we need to send refugees to Rwanda. And that was really painful. And you're just thinking, why? These are some of the world's most vulnerable people, and we're sending them to Rwanda. And it's just become normalised that the Rwanda policy didn't seem as crazy as it could have been, because we've just been jumping for, like, if you thought 10 years ago that we'd think about sending refugees to Rwanda, you wouldn't have dreamed of it. The Nationality and Borders Bill, or the crackdown on peaceful protests, you would never have thought that a British government would crack down on protests like that, or the systemic and institutional racism and sexism within the Met Police, the people that are there to protect Londoners. And it's just jumping further and further into a rabbit hole that is really scary. And where it started with Theresa May and the hostile environment, and we arrived at Rwanda, the Rwanda policy. So yeah, and when you look at like border crossings, the channel crossings with refugees, saying that our borders are being invaded, and I think Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor, called it swarms of people coming over, and invaders, and that language has been used since the Cameron government. But then you actually look at why they're crossing the channel. You know, everybody has a right to claim asylum in the country, but there are no safe and legal routes to claim asylum in the UK. If you can't get a visa to claim, so the first rule is that you have to be within the UK to claim asylum. Okay, so how do I get to the UK? Get a visa. They don't have an asylum visa. I get a tourist visa. You then break the rules of your visa and you get deported, because you've defrauded the visa system, saying you're coming as a tourist but to claim asylum. The legal schemes that are open are for, there was Afghanistan, Hong Kong, and there was a Syrian one, I believe. But again, 3 countries in the world. So when you're left with the only way to get into this country to claim asylum is the channel, it's no surprise that criminal gangs are exploiting that and making it into a business model. But you don't hear that. You don't hear that there are no legal ways for somebody from South Sudan to claim asylum here. You hear that there are military-aged men who are really economic migrants invading our southern borders. It's just not true. And political leadership is not actually saying that, not explaining the asylum system, or not explaining or challenging that, but instead feed into the rhetoric of that we need to smash the gangs, that, you know, we need to be, that now no asylum seekers who cross the channel to get into the UK can ever claim citizenship. It's punitive rather than actually addressing why people are crossing the channel. So there's that kind of political deception that's been going on for decades. And it's why people are so disillusioned and so angry at the government, and people like Farage, who has a Coots account and is a millionaire, is seen as like a hero for the working class because he is selling truth to power. Because there's been so much political deception, people are so untrusting of politicians, and also the ability for Westminster actually to make a change. And it's that kind of deception and scapegoating has undermined politicians' ability to actually bring people together to create change. So, and you don't just see it here, you see it in the US, you've seen it in India, you see it in the rise in Germany, Italy, France. And I think we really need to think about how language is so powerful as well. You know, when Elon Musk took over X, and then suddenly you see a rise in trolls and hate speech and things, and people are like, oh, it's only an online platform. You know, it was used to mobilize people in the riots in August. You know, you saw online speech becoming offline violence. And it's really terrifying. We need to really think about the way that we use our words. For example, like calling those who cross the channel illegal immigrants. There's nothing illegal about claiming asylum. Our own Supreme Court said the same thing. But if you keep telling people that they're illegal, you're going to build resentment and hatred for a community you've probably never met. So I think rhetoric and the responsibility for those who have the ability to shape the narrative is very important.
You briefly mentioned the conflicts within, for instance, the Asian community. Leicester, what is your take on that?
It's bringing the same kind of divisions that are in India here to the UK, and you know, there's still, with social media, WhatsApp, that kind of division can cross borders now. So it's well known that a lot of online hatred comes from India to the UK and stirs tensions here. But I would say, you know, when I listen to people who were right in the thick of fighting for social justice and equality in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they had no understanding of separating the community into Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, who were British Asians or politically black. And it was much more inclusive. And it was only in the last, you know, couple of decades that we've started dividing our communities further. And I think a really, really powerful thing is, so Tommy Robinson is become really close with, before he was arrested, was really close to Indian media, and there are actually Hindu groups marching with the EDL outside Downing Street a couple of weeks before the August riots. But then when the riots kicked off, they just saw, you know, I know countless people who were chased in the streets, spat at, and Nobody stopped to ask, are you Muslim or are you Hindu? Or it was just they saw a brown face and they chased you, beat you, stopped you at a checkpoint. And I think that kind of reminds us that, reminding us of what the struggles were for the generations before us in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the community as a whole, and why we need to have solidarity and build harmony and reduce tensions within our own communities, because we all share the same struggles. And in the face of racism and xenophobia and the rise of that element in the far right, it's something that it's going to be a battle that we all share together. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that in the community, that, so you look at Leicester, it's Indian Muslims predominantly and Indian Hindus. We come from one country, we have that shared history, our journeys, our patterns of migrations, are combined, are together. And I think we should remind ourselves of our similarities rather than our differences. And like I said, we start in our community, we build cross-community solidarity, and we build an inclusive society.
Yeah, maybe a final bit of outlook. What would you wish for?
I wish for a kinder politics, more inclusive community building, and fairness, equality, I think is so important. Whether that be financial inequality within our civil rights, within treatment of police, within representation, having more fairness and equality is, yeah.
No, I was just asking, Raul, very fascinating to understand about your mixed heritage, but I wanted to know, what is the best thing you value about your British identity, and what is the best thing you value about your Indian identity?
With my Indian identity, I think the lesson that was imparted to me and what I learnt very early on was really the importance of community. And I think growing up, whether that be within our family or within the wider community, the importance of supporting one another, being active in your community, building that group that, people rely on each other and help each other. And I think always from a young age, that was my main thing that I was taught. And they, like, whatever you do, you help others, you look out for other people. You are only as strong as the people that are with you. And I think you can see that, throughout, like I was saying, for me, the political kind of movements in India. But I think within a lot of diaspora communities here in the UK, that kind of needing to support and be part of your community. And my British one, I think, is the diversity. Like I said, I see myself as British, but not the old kind of imperial nostalgia British, but as a modern, diverse, fluid, accepting British. And the fact that I can walk through London and pass Lebanese food, Indian food, Italian food, that there's so much culture. And I think, the best of British really is when people come together and that kind of shared history.
Lovely, and I wish I had met you after your visit to India, because you said you haven't been there, but you're going there at the end of this year. Just wondered, if you went to India, do you fear that people would see you as a foreigner?
I think so. I think I've met many different Indian citizens who've been over here, and some have seen British Indians as not real Indians anymore. Some see us as brothers and sisters that remain very much connected. And if that does happen, like I said, for me, it's nothing new as somebody with mixed heritage. But I think it's different when you've left your home country, even down to the food. So I was speaking to some Indians from South Africa who were telling me about how their dal is different because of when they came to South Africa, some of the ingredients weren't readily available, so they had to mix and adapt, and now their dal is a completely evolved dish that's very different than what you would have in some places in India. And I said that's the same as our identity as British Indians. It's different. We've living in a different society, exposed to different cultures. Of course, we're not going to be the exact same as Indians living within India, but I don't think that invalidates our identity as British Indians and being able to remain connected to our homeland and to our country. It just means we experience it differently.
Have you ever considered going into politics full time, like being a MP or something like that?
It's something I've thought about, but for me, when the best MPs that I've met, and there are a very good number of them, the best MPs that I met have a specific reason why they entered politics or why they're in Parliament, whether it's a specific issue within their constituency or a vision that they have for the world. And I made that decision to go into politics because, like I said, I didn't want to defend people from the law, I wanted to change it. And if I find that I have a real purpose, or there is something that I think as an MP I can do to make that change, then of course I'd be open to it. But to go into politics without a real, like, public office, without a real conviction or a real direction of what you want to change and why, I think leads to the wrong people going into politics and forgetting why you're there and what that office is. It's, you know, I remember I gave a talk to local school kids and I was saying, you know, in a few years you're going to have the most powerful tool at your disposal that you will ever have. And they thought they meant that they were going to be able to use power tools or whatever. But I said, no, your vote. You know, MPs work for you. You get to decide whether they keep their job. You're their hiring committee. And I think knowing that and making sure that you're connected to the communities you serve and represent and reminding of why you're there and what you want to do is really important. So if that clear purpose and opportunity arises, then yeah.
How successful is your movement for democracy in Britain? Do the young British Asians connect with your ideology?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of support for what we're trying to build, and you know, we did polling and surveys, but just I think the most important test for me is going into communities and speaking to people. You know, there's people that support our work who are from completely different political parties, political preferences, but I think that one common thing that we can all agree on is the founding values in the Constitution of democracy, equality, secularism, and it doesn't really matter. It's the same way in the UK. I have friends that are Tories, I have friends who are Labour, Green, Lib Dems, but we all have that kind of common foundational values. And it's the same for our work. And there's a lot of support, and especially younger British Indians who are looking at international relations, foreign policy in a completely different way when you have what is happening and the genocide in Gaza, or the way that Russia invaded Ukraine. And it also, we have young British Indian volunteers who joined our work for the more community, the more exhibition side of our work, but stayed because they learned something about India, and for them it's a way of, again, reconnecting with their heritage. So yeah, there's all sorts of people that support our work and are involved in our movement. All come from different backgrounds for different reasons, but we're all there because we love India. We remain connected with India, and we all share those foundational values that built an independent India and built the world's largest democracy.